You can't run from me or from my children." The words echoed in Emily Carter's ears as she tightened her grip around the 3 tiny newborns in her arms, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give her away. Because just weeks ago her life looked nothing like this. There were no marble floors, no private hospital suite that cost more than she made in a year, no powerful man standing in the doorway watching her like he already owned everything she had left, including her future. Back then she was just a pool girl working under the blazing California sun, counting every dollar, every tip, every hour, trying to stay afloat while a crushing $50,000 debt closed in around her, threatening to take everything she had, her apartment, her dignity, her chance at a normal life. And when the final notice came, cold and unforgiving, she realized she had run out of time, out of options, out of hope, until the night everything changed. The night she was called to work a private event at one of the most exclusive estates in the city. A place so far removed from her reality it felt like stepping into another world, where the air was quieter, heavier, where people didn't look at prices, they owned them. And that was where she first saw him, Alexander Hayes. A billionaire whose name carried weight in every room. A man known for his control, his precision, his refusal to let anything or anyone disrupt the order of his world. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't mingling. He was observing. And somehow, impossibly, his attention landed on her, not the guests in designer suits, not the women who clearly belonged in that setting, but her, a girl in a simple uniform trying not to be noticed. And later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened into the background, he approached her with a calm that felt almost unsettling, his voice low, measured, direct, as if he had already decided the outcome of a conversation she hadn't even agreed to have yet. And then he said it, the offer that would split her life in two. Before and after, one night. No expectations, no complications, and in return, every debt erased, every problem gone. A clean slate. It sounded unreal, impossible, like something out of a story she didn't belong in. And for a moment she wanted to walk away, to pretend she had never heard it. But reality has a way of pulling harder than pride. And when you're standing at the edge with nothing left to lose, even the unthinkable starts to feel like a choice. She told herself it would end there. Just one night, just one decision, and then she would be free. But now, standing in that hospital room with 3 lives depending on her, 3 tiny reminders that nothing about that night was simple, nothing was over. She realized the truth she had been avoiding. That one decision hadn't freed her. It had tied her to a world far bigger, far more dangerous than she ever imagined. And as Alexander Hayes stepped closer, his presence filling the room with quiet authority, his eyes fixed not just on the children but on her, she understood something else, something even more terrifying. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't something she could hide from or outrun. This was the beginning of something she had no control over, and deep down, she knew her life was no longer her own. Emily could not breathe as the weight of his words settled over her, not because of how loud they were, but because of how certain they sounded, as if this moment had been inevitable from the very beginning. And for a brief second, she wanted to deny everything, to tell him he was wrong, to take her children and disappear before his world could close in around them. But her body refused to move, frozen between fear and something she could not yet understand, because deep down she knew this. Confrontation had been building long before this moment, long before the hospital, long before the truth had become impossible to ignore, her mind flashing back to the days after she walked away from that estate, when she told herself it was over, that she had made a decision she would never have to face again. She remembered holding the confirmation letter that her debt had been cleared, every dollar gone as promised. It should have felt like freedom. It should have felt like relief, but instead it felt strangely empty, like something had been taken from her that she could not name, and she tried to move on, picking up extra shifts, keeping her head down, convincing herself that normal life was still within reach, until the morning everything shifted again, when the dizziness started, subtle at first, easy to ignore, until it was not, until it followed her through every hour of the day, until even standing under the sun by the pool felt like too much. And when she finally sat in that small clinic room, staring at the doctor who hesitated just long enough to make her heart drop, she knew before the words even came, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Not just pregnant, but three heartbeats, 3 lives forming all at once. And the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in, because suddenly that one decision was no longer something she could leave behind. It was something growing, something real, something that would tie her forever to a man she barely knew. And she had made a choice then, a desperate one, to keep it to herself, to protect what little control she had left, telling no one, not even considering going back to him. Because how could she face someone like Alexander Hayes and tell him something that would change everything? How could she walk into his world again without losing herself completely? So she stayed silent, counting the weeks, working until she could not anymore, saving every dollar, preparing in the only way she knew how, alone, until the day everything caught up to her. When the truth could no longer be hidden behind loose clothing and quiet determination, when circumstances forced her into this hospital, into this room, into this moment where there was no more hiding. And now he was here, standing only a few feet away, looking at the children with an intensity that made her chest tighten, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. And as his gaze slowly lifted to meet hers, steady and unyielding, she realized that whatever she had hoped for, whatever plan she thought she could control, it was already slipping through her fingers, because this was no longer just her secret, it was his reality too. And men like Alexander Hayes did not walk away from something that belonged to them, especially not something this significant. And the quiet in the room felt heavier than any argument, because no matter what she said next, one truth remained unavoidable. She had tried to keep her distance, to protect her independence, but now the line between her world and his had disappeared completely, and there was no clear way back. Alexander did not speak right away, and somehow that silence felt more overwhelming than anything he could have said, because Emily could see the shift happening behind his eyes, the careful calculation, the quiet recognition, the kind of awareness that came from a man who was used to understanding situations before anyone else even realized what was happening. And when he finally stepped closer, the distance between them disappeared in a way that made her instinctively tighten her hold on the babies, not out of fear of him hurting them, but out of fear of losing control of the only thing that still felt like hers. Her voice came out softer than she intended as she said she had planned to tell him eventually, but even as the words left her lips, she knew they sounded weak, incomplete, because the truth was she had been avoiding this exact moment, and Alexander seemed to hear everything she did not say, his gaze steady as he looked from one child to the next with a focus that felt almost unreal, as if he was memorizing every detail, every feature, every small movement. And when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, but carried a weight that left no room for misunderstanding as he said that she should have come to him the moment she found out, not because of obligation, but because nothing about this was something she needed to handle alone. And that statement caught her off guard because it was not what she expected. She expected anger, accusations, control, but instead there was something else beneath his words, something controlled yet undeniable, and it unsettled her more than anything else could have. She quickly responded that she did not want anything from him, that she had handled everything on her own and planned to continue doing so, that the deal they made was over and she did not intend to reopen it. And for a brief moment, something almost unreadable crossed his expression before it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by the same composed exterior that made him so difficult to predict. He took another step closer, but this time his attention was fully on her, not the children, not the situation, just her. And he said quietly that she was misunderstanding something important, that this was no longer about a past agreement or a transaction. This was about responsibility, about reality, about 3 lives that connected them, whether she wanted that connection or not. And Emily felt her chest tighten again, because those words carried a truth she could not easily push away. She had spent months convincing herself she could separate her life from his, that she could build something independent, something safe. But now standing in front of him, it felt like that belief was slowly unraveling. She tried to hold on to her resolve, insisting that she had already made plans, that she would raise them on her own, that she did not need his world or his influence complicating things. But even as she spoke, she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice, because deep down she knew the scale of what she was facing. 3 children, endless responsibilities, a future filled with challenges she had only begun to understand. And Alexander did not interrupt her. He let her speak, let her hold on to that fragile sense of control for just a moment longer before he finally responded with a quiet certainty that changed everything again. He said that independence did not mean isolation, and that refusing support did not make her stronger if it placed unnecessary limits on their future. And the way he said there made her pause, because it was subtle but intentional, as if he had already accepted a role she was still trying to deny him. And then he added something that made her heart skip in a way she could not explain. He said that whether she liked it or not, this was not a situation he would walk away from, not because of obligation, but because walking away was simply not who he was. And as those words settled between them, Emily realized that this was no longer just about survival or choices or even the past. This was the beginning of something far more complex, something that would challenge everything she thought she understood about control, about independence, and about the kind of future she believed she could create on her own. Emily felt the room grow quieter as his words settled in, not because the world had actually gone silent, but because everything inside her had started to shift. The certainty she had been holding on to now colliding with a reality she could no longer control. And for a moment she said nothing, her eyes drifting down to the three small faces resting peacefully in her arms, each one unaware of the tension building around them, unaware that their existence had just changed everything. And she realized something she had been avoiding for months, that no matter how strong she tried to be, no matter how determined she was to build a life on her own terms, this situation was bigger than anything she had ever faced. And yet that realization did not make it easier to accept his presence, because Alexander Hayes was not just help, he was influence, power, a world that could easily swallow her whole if she was not careful. And she had spent her entire life trying to stay in control of what little she had. So letting him in felt like risking everything she had fought to protect. She finally looked up at him again, her voice steadier. This time as she said that she was not asking him to walk away. She just needed time. Time to think. Time to understand what this meant without being overwhelmed by everything he represented. And for the first time since he walked into the room, there was a slight pause in his expression, not resistance, not disagreement, but consideration, as if he was measuring her words against something deeper. And after a moment he nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging her request in a way that surprised her, because she expected him to push, to insist, but instead he stepped back just enough to give her space. Though his presence still filled the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore him completely, he told her that time was reasonable, but avoidance was not, and that whatever decisions she made next needed to be based on reality, not fear. And that statement lingered in her mind because it struck closer to the truth than she wanted to admit. She had been afraid of losing herself, afraid of depending on someone else, afraid of stepping into a world where she did not belong. And now she was being forced to confront those fears head on. He then reached into his pocket and placed a simple card on the table beside her. Nothing flashy, just his name and a number. But somehow it felt heavier than anything else in the room. He said that when she was ready to talk, truly ready, she would know how to reach him. And that until then he would make sure everything she and the children needed was taken care of, not as a condition, not as leverage, but as a responsibility he had no intention of ignoring. And that distinction mattered more than she expected, because it removed the transactional nature she had been holding on to, replacing it with something she was not sure how to define yet. Something that made the situation feel less like a deal and more like a connection she could not easily break. She watched as he turned toward the door, his movements calm, controlled, as if he had already accepted whatever came next. And just before he left he paused, glancing back at her one more time. His voice quieter now, but carrying the same certainty as before as he said that this was only the beginning, not something temporary, not something that would fade with time. And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not empty, but full of unanswered questions. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze returning to the card on the table, knowing that picking it up would mean acknowledging a path she had not planned for, a future that was no longer simple or predictable. And as she looked down at the children again, she realized that whatever decision she made next would not just shape her life, it would shape theirs too. And for the first time since everything began, she understood that this was not about choosing between independence and dependence. It was about finding a way to navigate a reality where both existed at the same time. And that realization made one thing clear: there was no easy way forward, only choices that would define everything that came next. The silence he left behind did not feel peaceful. It felt like a pause before something inevitable, and Emily sat there for a long moment without moving, her eyes fixed on the simple card resting on the table, as if it carried more weight than the entire room. She told herself she would not pick it up, that she did not need what it represented, that she could still choose her own path. But even as she repeated those thoughts in her mind, she could feel them losing strength, because reality had already begun to shift in ways she could not ignore. The hospital staff who had once treated her like any other patient now moved with a different level of attention, subtle but noticeable, the kind of careful professionalism that suggested someone had made sure nothing would be overlooked. And she did not need to ask who that someone was. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet adjustments. Forms were handled faster than expected. Resources appeared without her requesting them. And every time she tried to convince herself it was just coincidence, she found another small detail that told her otherwise. A nurse gently assuring her that everything was arranged. A coordinator mentioning that follow-up care had already been scheduled, each moment reinforcing the same truth. Alexander had not waited for her decision to begin taking action, and that realization stirred something complicated inside her, part frustration, part relief, part uncertainty about what it meant for her independence. When she was finally discharged, the contrast between her past and present became even clearer. The modest apartment she had struggled to maintain no longer felt suitable for 3 newborns. The narrow space, the worn furniture, the constant worry about bills. It all pressed in on her in a way it never had before, and for the first time she allowed herself to consider what raising 3 children there would actually look like. Not just emotionally, but practically. The sleepless nights, the medical needs, the financial strain, and as much as she wanted to prove she could handle it alone, she could not ignore the growing gap between what she wanted and what was realistic. She moved carefully through the small space, placing the babies down one by one, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to build a plan that made sense. But every path she considered seemed to circle back to the same obstacle. Limitations she could not overcome by determination alone. And then her gaze landed on the card again, still tucked into her bag, untouched but impossible to forget. She hesitated before pulling it out, her fingers brushing over the surface as if testing the weight of the decision it represented. Calling him would mean opening a door she had been trying to keep closed. It would mean acknowledging that this situation was not something she could fully control. But not calling him would mean continuing down a path filled with uncertainty and risk. And for a long moment, she stood there caught between those two choices, until one of the babies stirred softly, a small sound that instantly pulled her attention back, reminding her that this was no longer just about her pride or her fears. It was about them, their future, their stability, and that clarity shifted something inside her, not completely removing her hesitation, but reshaping it into something more focused, more grounded. She exhaled slowly and looked down at the number again, realizing that reaching out did not mean giving up control. It meant redefining what control actually looked like in a situation this complex. Her thumb hovered over her phone as she entered the digits, each number feeling like a step further into a world she had never intended to be part of. And when the line began to ring, her heart started to race in a way she could not stop, because she knew that once he answered there would be no going back to the simplicity she once had, only forward into something uncertain but unavoidable. And as the call connected and his voice came through calm and steady, as if he had been expecting this moment all along, she realized that the line she had tried to keep between their lives had finally disappeared, replaced by a connection that was now impossible to ignore. Emily's breath caught the moment she heard his voice on the other end of the line, calm and steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact call. And for a second, she could not find the words she had rehearsed in her mind, because somehow speaking to him directly made everything feel more real, more permanent. She finally managed to say his name quietly, almost unsure of herself, and there was no surprise in his response, only a simple acknowledgement that made it clear he already knew it was her. which only made her pulse quicken. She forced herself to stay focused, explaining that she needed to talk, that there were things they had to figure out, and before she could say anything else, he responded that he would send a car, not asking where she was, not questioning her decision, just moving forward as if this next step had already been decided. She hesitated for a brief moment, but then gave him the address, knowing that saying no would only delay what was already unfolding. Less than an hour later, a sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment, standing out sharply against the worn-down building, a quiet but undeniable reminder of the difference between their worlds. Emily carefully gathered the babies, her movements slower than usual. Not because she was unsure of what to do, but because she could feel the weight of what this moment represented. Stepping into that car meant stepping into something far bigger than a conversation. It meant entering his space, his terms, even if she intended to hold on to her own boundaries. The drive was silent, smooth, and longer than she expected, taking her further away from the familiar streets she had known and into parts of the city she had only ever seen from a distance, until finally the car passed through a set of gates and into a property that felt almost unreal, expansive, controlled, everything in its place. She felt a subtle tightening in her chest as she stepped out, adjusting her hold on the babies, reminding herself that she was here for them, not for him. The door opened before she could knock, and she was led inside. The interior just as polished as the exterior, every detail carefully curated, nothing out of place. And then she saw him, standing in the center of it, all as if the entire space was simply an extension of his presence. Alexander did not move immediately, his gaze settling on her, and then on the children, a brief pause that felt intentional. Before he finally stepped forward, his attention sharp but not overwhelming. He gestured for her to sit, his voice even as he said they should talk somewhere comfortable, and Emily followed, her senses alert, taking in every detail while trying not to feel out of place. Once seated, she wasted no time, explaining that she had not come there to hand over control or to become part of something she did not understand, that she was willing to discuss what was necessary, but she needed clear boundaries. Her words firm even if her surroundings made them feel smaller. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and when she finished he nodded once, acknowledging her stance in a way that suggested he respected her directness. He responded that boundaries were not a problem as long as they were based on reality, and that the reality was simple. Their lives were now connected in a way that required cooperation, not avoidance. He explained that he had already arranged support for the children, not to take them away from her, but to ensure they had access to everything they would need: medical care, space, stability, things she should not have to struggle to provide alone. And while part of her wanted to push back, to insist that she could manage without his involvement, another part of her could not ignore the logic in his words, because everything he described was exactly what she had been worrying about. The difference was that he had the ability to make it happen instantly, and she did not. The conversation shifted then, not into conflict, but into something more measured, more strategic, as if they were both beginning to understand that this was not a battle to be won, but a situation to be navigated. And as Emily sat there listening, responding, slowly adjusting to the reality in front of her, she realized that this meeting was not about deciding whether he would be part of their lives. That decision had already been made the moment she picked up the phone. This was about defining how that presence would shape everything moving forward. And that was a question she was only just beginning to answer. Emily could feel the shift happening even as the conversation continued. Not something sudden or dramatic, but a slow and steady realization that the ground beneath her had already changed. And the more they spoke, the clearer it became that this was no longer about resisting his involvement, but about understanding the role he was inevitably going to play. She watched him carefully, trying to read beyond his calm exterior, trying to understand what drove his decisions, because everything about him suggested control, yet there was a consistency in his words that did not feel manipulative. It felt deliberate, and that made it harder to push back. She finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since the moment he walked into that hospital room. Why he was so certain, why he was so willing to step into something so complex without hesitation. And for the first time there was a subtle pause before he answered. Not uncertainty, but consideration. As if he was choosing his words with more care than before, He explained that he did not see this as stepping into something new, but as acknowledging something that already existed, that ignoring it would not simplify anything. It would only create problems later. And that kind of thinking was not something he entertained. He then added, that responsibility was not something he approached halfway. That once something became part of his reality, he dealt with it completely. And as she listened, Emily realized that his perspective was fundamentally different from hers. Where she had been focused on survival, on protecting what little she had, he was focused on structure, on building something that would not fall apart under pressure. And that difference was not just about resources, it was about mindset. The conversation moved forward with a new tone after that, less defensive, more focused. They began discussing practical details, where the children would stay, what kind of support would be put in place, how decisions would be made. And with each topic, Emily found herself speaking more openly than she expected, not because she had fully let go of her concerns, but because she could see that avoiding these conversations would not protect her. It would only leave her unprepared. Alexander listened closely, responding with clarity, adjusting where necessary. And while he remained firm in certain areas, he did not dismiss her input, which created a balance she had not anticipated, one that made the situation feel less one-sided than she feared. At one point, he suggested that the current arrangement at her apartment was not sustainable, not as a criticism, but as a fact. And while she instinctively wanted to defend it, she could not deny the truth in his statement. 3 newborns required more space, more stability, more access than she could realistically provide in that environment. He proposed a temporary solution, a residence that would give her the independence she wanted while ensuring the children had what they needed, making it clear that it would be her space, not his, a distinction that caught her attention because it addressed one of her biggest concerns without her having to state it directly. She did not agree immediately, but she did not reject it either. Instead, she asked questions, clarifying details, testing the boundaries of what he was offering. And with each answer, the idea became less intimidating and more practical, more like a step forward rather than a surrender. And as the conversation continued, she began to notice something else, something subtle but significant. The way he looked at the children was not distant or detached. It was focused, present, as if he was already considering their future in ways she had only just begun to process. And that observation shifted something inside her again, because it introduced a possibility she had not fully allowed herself to consider, that his involvement might not take away from her role, but could actually strengthen what she was trying to build. The thought did not erase her hesitation, but it changed its shape, turning it from resistance into caution, something she could work with rather than something that held her back. And by the time the conversation reached a natural pause, Emily realized that while she had not made a final decision about everything, she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer trying to keep him out of their lives. She was beginning to figure out how to let him in on her terms. And that shift, quiet as it was, marked the true beginning of everything that would come next. Emily did not realize how much had changed until she found herself standing in a place that no longer felt temporary. The new residence, quiet and spacious, designed with a level of care that made every detail feel intentional. And yet it was not overwhelming in the way she feared. It was calm, structured, a space that allowed her to breathe while still reminding her that this was not something she had built alone. The first few days passed with a strange sense of balance, routines forming around the needs of the children, support arriving without intrusion, everything functioning in a way that felt almost too smooth. And that was what unsettled her the most, because she was used to struggle, to things not working perfectly, to having to adjust constantly. But here there was a sense of stability that felt unfamiliar, and she found herself questioning it, wondering what it meant in the long term. Alexander did not appear constantly, which surprised her. Instead, his presence was consistent, but measured, checking in, ensuring things were in place, but never stepping in without reason. And that distance created space for her to adjust without feeling overwhelmed. Yet it also left her with questions she could not ignore. One afternoon, as she watched the children resting peacefully, she realized that while she had focused so much on protecting her independence, she had not fully considered what this new reality would mean beyond the immediate needs, what kind of life they would grow into, what expectations would come with his name, and whether she was prepared to navigate that world alongside him. That thought lingered as the days turned into a steady rhythm, until one evening when Alexander arrived without prior notice. his expression more focused than usual, not tense but purposeful, and something in his demeanor immediately told her this was not a routine visit. He asked if they could talk, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that made her set aside what she was doing. Without hesitation, they moved to a quieter part of the house, and for a moment he said nothing, as if organizing his thoughts, before finally explaining that there were external factors they needed to consider, not threats, not immediate problems, but attention, the kind that followed someone in his position, attention that would eventually extend to her and the children whether they wanted it or not. And that was when she felt the shift again, not internal this time, but external. The realization that their situation was not isolated, that it existed within a larger world that came with its own expectations and pressures. He explained that it was only a matter of time before questions were asked, before people began to notice patterns, and that preparing for that reality now would give them more control later. Emily listened carefully, her mind processing the implications, because this was something she had not truly accounted for. She had been so focused on immediate survival and adjustment that she had not fully considered how visible their situation could become. She asked what that preparation would involve, and his response was measured, thoughtful. He spoke about discretion, about managing information, about creating a narrative that protected the children while maintaining stability. And while none of it sounded unreasonable, it added a new layer to everything she had been navigating. A layer that required her to think beyond herself in a way that felt both necessary and daunting. She realized that this was not just about building a life anymore. It was about protecting it from influences she could not fully control. And as she sat there absorbing everything he was saying, she understood that the choices they made now would shape not only their private world, but how that world interacted with everything outside it. And for the first time since stepping into this new reality, she felt the true scope of what lay ahead, not just emotionally or practically, but socially, publicly, in ways she had never experienced before. And as Alexander finished speaking, his gaze steady as always, she knew that this was another turning point, one that would require her to step even further into a life she had never planned for. Because this was no longer just about adapting to change, it was about preparing for what that change would bring next. Emily sat in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking, the weight of everything settling in slowly rather than all at once. And she realized that this was no longer about reacting to what had already happened. It was about preparing for what was coming next, a future that extended far beyond the walls of the home she was standing in, beyond the quiet routine she had just begun to adjust to, and into a world where every decision carried consequences she could not fully predict. She looked toward the room where the children were resting, their presence grounding her in a way nothing else could, and it became clear that every choice she made now had to be measured against one question. What kind of life was she building for them? Not just in terms of comfort or security, but identity, stability, and the kind of environment they would grow up in. She turned back to Alexander, her expression more focused than before, the hesitation still there, but no longer controlling her. And she told him that if they were going to move forward with this, it could not be based only on his world or his rules. It had to be something they built together, something that allowed her to remain present in the way she needed to be, not just as their mother, but as someone who still had a voice in how their lives were shaped. There was a brief pause after she spoke, not tension but recognition. And then he nodded, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement that what she was asking for was reasonable. He responded that partnership required clarity, and that if they were going to navigate what was ahead, they needed to be aligned not just on decisions, but on expectations. He explained that there would be moments when his experience in handling public attention would guide their choices, just as there would be moments when her understanding of the children's needs would take priority, and that balance, while not simple, was necessary. Emily listened carefully, recognizing that this was the first time their conversation had shifted fully into something mutual, something that resembled a shared direction rather than two separate paths trying to coexist. She took a slow breath and nodded, not because she had all the answers, but because she understood that waiting for certainty was no longer an option. This was something that would have to be built step by step, decision by decision, trust by trust. And as that realization settled in, she felt something unexpected, not fear, not resistance, but a quiet sense of determination. The kind that comes from accepting that while the path ahead is uncertain, it is still one she can choose how to walk. Alexander stepped closer then, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to make his presence clear, his voice steady as he said that what came next would not always be easy, that there would be challenges neither of them could anticipate, but that avoiding those challenges would not protect them. It would only leave them unprepared, and she knew he was right, because everything about the past weeks had already proven that reality. She glanced once more toward the children and then back at him, and in that moment something shifted again, not in the circumstances around them, but in how she saw them, no longer as an overwhelming force she had to resist, but as a situation she had the strength to face, even if she had to learn as she went. And as the conversation came to a natural close, she realized that this was not an ending, not even close. It was the beginning of something far more complex than anything she had ever planned, a life that would test her, challenge her, and force her to grow in ways she had never imagined. And as she stood there with that understanding settling in, one thought became clear above all else. Whatever came next would not be something she faced alone, but whether that would become her greatest strength or her greatest challenge was a question that had yet to be answered.